Listen closely, because what I'm about to tell you is not the kind of story you walk away from unchanged. Imagine this: a bride in her lace gown, veil trembling against the Virginia summer air, the crowd of townsfolk smiling, applauding, whispering blessings, yet not a single one of them warns her that by nightfall her body will be lowered into the soil of the Blackwood family plot, not in death, but in trial. A polished coffin awaits her, lined in silk like a cradle for eternity, and in her hand a single silver bell, her only tether to the living world above. "Ring it," they said, "and your husband will hear you. Ring it, and he will come." But what if the bell was never meant to save her? What if its true purpose was to test how long she could scream before her name was swallowed by earth? This is the story of Eleanor Whitfield, a woman who married into wealth, but found herself instead chained to a ritual older than her vows, a tradition of cruelty dressed in the language of devotion. The Blackwood name was not only a dynasty of land and fortune, it was a dynasty of silence, and in silence, entire generations of brides vanished, their graves disguised as wedding beds. The hook lies in this question: what does it mean when a community applauds a wedding by day and buries its bride alive by night? What does it mean when love itself becomes a weapon and the price of survival is written in the dirt above your head? You see, the true terror of this story isn't just the coffin or the suffocating dark Eleanor was forced into. It's the complicity. The elders who sat in the front row, their eyes averted while the vows bent into something sinister. The preacher who spoke of endurance, not joy. The servants who whispered warnings too late. And the town that brought casseroles to the grieving widower the next week, pretending they believed his story of a bride taken too soon. This is not just one family's horror, it is a ledger of erased women, of whispered initials carved into coffin wood, of townsfolk who chose survival over truth. And if you listen closely, you'll hear it for yourself, the faint chime of a silver bell beneath the earth, ringing not for love, but for justice that never came. Now, you and I are about to step into that coffin with Eleanor. We will feel the satin against our palms, the air thinning, the bell slipping in our hands. But more than that, we will uncover the truth that families, churches, and entire towns built walls to keep hidden. You think this is a ghost story? It's not. This is a story about power, about control, about rituals meant to silence the defiant and erase the inconvenient. And once you see what Eleanor saw carved into the walls around her, names, dates, scratches of desperation from brides buried before her, you'll realize something chilling. She was never alone down there. She was only the latest chapter in a history designed to repeat. So let's begin. With a wedding bell, a silver bell, and the sound of earth falling heavy on a satin lid. The wedding of Eleanor Whitfield to Alistair Blackwood was no simple ceremony of lace and vows. It was a pageant. A theatre of wealth meant to dazzle the eyes of the valley. Magnolia garlands curled around the iron gates of Blackwood Manor, a brass band shimmered with rehearsed notes, and women in pastel gowns shaded themselves beneath parasols, whispering of fortune and prestige. But behind their polite smiles, there lingered a tension, the kind that makes a crowd look too long at the bride and too little at the groom. Eleanor walked down the aisle like a figure painted into a tableau, her white dress radiant, her veil soft as fog, yet her eyes betrayed the faint tremor of someone stepping into a cage. She was only 20, fresh-faced, carrying the gentle pas de deux, a grace of youth. Her family's debts had been smoothed away with this marriage, their prospects lifted. To most, she should have looked like salvation itself, yet her steps were heavy, and beneath the veil, her lips pressed into silence, a silence no one dared name. Alistair Blackwood, her husband-to-be, stood waiting, handsome in the way power distorts perception. Twice her age, his posture polished by inheritance and command. He smiled for the crowd, but up close, his eyes cut sharper than a blade. He was not speaking vows, he was issuing terms. And when he said the words, "My love is absolute," demanding absolute devotion, the crowd shifted. They did not gasp, they did not protest. They adjusted their collars, smoothed their coats, glanced away as if they had heard it all before. The Reverend's blessing was no comfort either. His voice, monotone, carried across the gathering with words of sacrifice, endurance, thresholds, not joy, not prosperity. He spoke as though invoking a ritual older than scripture, as though he too was bound to a pact none dared break. His gaze never left Alistair's, as if the sermon was not meant for the couple but for the groom alone. In the back stood Martha, Eleanor's maid, the one who had raised her since childhood. Her face was drawn tight with unspoken warning, her hands twisted against one another, her body trembling as though she were a witness to a play she had watched before but could not stop. And nearby Thomas, the estate manager, looked to the ground, his jaw rigid, unwilling to meet the bride's gaze. Both of them knew more than they would ever dare say. And then there was Mrs. Blackwood, Alistair's mother, a frail shadow of a woman dressed in lace gloves too loose for her thinning frame. She whispered not blessings, but fragments of broken phrases. He always takes them back, always back again. The words spilled from her lips like a secret her mind could no longer contain. A few caught them and quickly turned away, as though to hear was to inherit the burden of truth. The ceremony ended, with applause, thin, mechanical, rehearsed. The music swelled, the bride and groom turned, and Eleanor's smile froze across her face like porcelain. The applause was not for her happiness, it was for the preservation of the order, for the continuation of a tradition wrapped in flowers and hymns, but stained with fear. That day, Eleanor did not marry a man. She married into a machine, a lineage, a ritual, a darkness disguised as devotion. And the town, with its elders and its servants and its preacher, all played their part in the silence. They had seen this before. They would see it again. The question is not why no one stopped it. The question is, what did they gain by letting it happen? What does a community gain by burying its brides alive and calling it love? Eleanor would not ask those questions. Not yet. For now, she only felt the weight of eyes on her, watching not with joy, but with calculation. Her life had been absorbed into the estate, her fate sealed not with a kiss, but with complicity. The bell had not yet rung. The coffin had not yet closed. But even then, beneath the wedding veil and the applause, she was already being lowered into silence. The first weeks of Eleanor's marriage unfolded like a carefully staged illusion. To any outsider glancing from afar, it seemed idyllic. An attentive husband guiding his young bride through manicured gardens, horseback rides along the river's edge, picnics under the canopy of oak trees where servants spread quilts and delicacies she had only ever read about. Alistair presented wealth as though it were love itself, feeding Eleanor exotic fruits and whispering words of admiration that slipped easily from his lips. But admiration is not affection, and generosity can be the most gilded form of control. Even in those early days, Eleanor felt the edges of the trap tightening. Alistair insisted on selecting her attire each morning, young fabrics pale as bone, collars tight against her throat. When she once reached for one of her own worn books, a volume she had cherished since girlhood, he took it from her hands and smiled. "A lady of this house has no need for borrowed words," he told her. The book never returned. His compliments carried the tone of appraisal, as if cataloguing an object he owned rather than loving a wife he had chosen. At dinner, when she shared a childhood memory that drew laughter from Martha, Alistair's gaze hardened. The following night, Martha was ordered to dine apart with the servants. When Eleanor suggested inviting her cousin for a visit, his refusal was absolute. The Blackwoods keep to their own. In that sentence lay a rule not of family but of isolation. Blackwood Manor itself seemed built to amplify this imprisonment. The corridors, though grand, narrowed like veins leading deeper into a body that was not her own. Doors locked without explanation. Windows opened onto gardens that looked more like walled fortresses. Portraits of stern ancestors stared down from gilded frames, their expressions coldly approving. The household moved with a rehearsed quietness, as though sound itself were forbidden, as though laughter might stir something best left sleeping. Martha, her most loyal companion, spoke less freely now, her words clipped, her silences weighted, yet her eyes still spoke in moments when lips could not. One morning, as she fastened Eleanor's gown, her hands trembled. In a whisper nearly inaudible, she said, "He likes obedience above all, ma'am. Be cautious." Then she fell silent again, as if even that warning had endangered them both. Eleanor's unease deepened when, passing through the service corridor, she overheard Martha speaking in hushed tones to Thomas, the estate manager. The words drifted through the half-open door. "Not like the lady before. She's too spirited. It won't end the same." A chair clattered to the floor, and when Eleanor entered, they both fell into silence. Thomas muttered about accounts. Martha busied herself with linens. Neither looked her in the eye, but the phrase clung to Eleanor's mind like a splinter. The lady before. Who was she? What had become of her? Why was her fate spoken of in past tense, as though she had vanished into air? Alistair's games became sharper. He hid Eleanor's hairpins, her ribbons, watching her search until he revealed them with a smile. "You must learn patience, my dear. Love is tested in the smallest ways." He misled her about the hour of carriage rides, arriving late only to chastise her for impatience. Each cruelty was minor, deniable, but together they wove a net around her, pulling tighter with every gesture. At night, beneath the canopy of their bed, Eleanor lay awake, listening to the silence press against her. The laughter had been stripped from her days, her books taken, her companions exiled. The house itself pulsed with unspoken laws. The air was heavy with something unsaid. And in that silence, a question haunted her most of all. What had happened to the women who came before her? The answer, she feared, was carved not in words spoken aloud, but into the very walls of Blackwood Manor, waiting to be discovered. The night Alistair summoned Eleanor to his study, the air felt heavier than usual, thick with the smell of tobacco and old wood. The room itself was a vault of secrets, shelves lined with books whose spines bore the weight of centuries, their dust unbroken, their knowledge locked away. Heavy curtains strangled the last of the daylight, and a fire glowed low in the grate, throwing shadows across carved furniture that seemed more like thrones than chairs. Alistair's tone was different that evening, softer but sharpened at the edges, coaxing rather than commanding. He spoke like a man leading an animal into a pen, careful, deliberate. At the center of the study stood an object she had not seen before, an antique chest, its brass fittings catching the firelight. His hand rested upon it with a reverence that unsettled her. "This," he said, "is the heart of the Blackwood legacy." With a sharp motion, he lifted the lid. Inside was not clothing, not heirlooms, not papers of inheritance, but a coffin, polished mahogany, its satin interior gleaming pale as bone. At first Eleanor could not speak. The sight of it in such a setting was too jarring, too obscene. Yet Alistair's expression carried no trace of shame. On the contrary, he looked proud, almost exultant, as though unveiling a treasure. She stepped back, her breath catching in her throat. "What is this?" "A tradition," he said, "a sacred rite of my family." From a hidden compartment he drew out a silver bell attached to a long cord. Its surface shone in the firelight, delicate, fragile, yet piercing in its clarity. He pressed it into her palm, curling her fingers around it with deliberate care. "This will be with you," he said. "When you ring it, I will hear. I will come for you. That is how love endures beyond fear itself." Eleanor shook her head, disbelief clawing at her composure. "You mean inside?" Alistair's gaze sharpened. He leaned close, lowering his voice until it carried the intimacy of menace. "My great-grandmother endured the trial. She was placed within this coffin, lowered beneath the earth. When she rang the bell, her husband returned. Their bond was unbroken. From them, this house grew strong. It has been our way ever since." She recoiled, horror unraveling the mask of obedience she had forced herself to wear. "This is madness." Before the word had fully left her lips, his hand gripped her wrist, iron strong. His voice turned cold, stripped of its charm. "Do not speak so carelessly. It is not madness. It is devotion. You will prove your love, as all have before you." Eleanor struggled, but his grip only tightened. Then his words struck deeper than flesh. "Refuse, and your family will suffer. Do you think your father's debts are forgotten? Do you imagine your brother's future will survive scandal? This union has lifted them. Do not endanger what they have gained." The truth landed like a knife. She was not a bride. She was a hostage. Her marriage was not salvation, but collateral, and the coffin before her was not ceremony, it was inheritance. Alistair finally released her wrist, certain of her submission. He stroked the polished wood as if caressing an altar. "Endure," he whispered, "and when I come for you, our love will be eternal." The bell trembled in her hand. Its delicate chime rang once, faint and piercing, shimmering in the firelight like an eye that never blinked. But to Eleanor, it did not sound like salvation. It sounded like a trap, and for the first time since her vows, she understood the truth that chilled her blood. This family did not marry brides. It buried them. The night of the ritual arrived without warning. One moment Eleanor was seated at dinner, the clatter of silverware echoing in the hushed hall. The next she was being led across the estate grounds under the cover of lantern light. The air was damp, carrying the scent of soil and magnolia, though both smelled more like mourning than celebration. They guided her toward the family plot, a patch of earth fenced in iron, half swallowed by vines, where crooked stones leaned as though ashamed to stand upright. The graves stretched back generations, but tonight there was no mourning, no hymns of loss. Instead, the gathering carried the silence of complicity. Men stood in shadow, faces grim and unreadable, while women clutched shawls close, their eyes lowered. The coffin waited, its polished mahogany gleaming unnaturally in the lantern light, satin interior pale as a shroud. Alistair stood beside it, calm, unflinching, his hand resting on the lid like a priest at his altar. To him this was not cruelty, it was tradition, his inheritance, his right. The Reverend began to speak, his voice steady and resonant, but his words bent towards something darker than blessing. He did not invoke joy, or even peace. He invoked endurance, sacrifice, the triumph of devotion over fear. His prayer was not for Eleanor's life, but for her obedience. Martha, trembling at Eleanor's side, clutched her sleeve, whispering desperately, "Don't go, don't let them." Before Thomas's hand pulled her back into silence, his jaw was tight, his eyes averted. He would not look at Eleanor. He would not risk betraying what he knew. They pressed a tincture to Eleanor's lips, sweet and bitter all at once, dulling her fear into a sluggish fog. Her steps grew heavy, her body moved without will. She was awake, but her will was shackled, her breath already carrying the weight of surrender. As she was laid into the coffin, the satin seemed to embrace her like cold skin. The silver bell trembled in her hand, its surface reflecting her pale face back at her, distorted in the wavering light. She clutched it as though it were life itself, though in her heart she already suspected it was only a symbol of mockery. Alistair leaned down, his voice for her alone. "Endure, and I will come." His tone was not tender, not promising, final, absolute, the verdict of a man who believed himself both judge and savior. The lid closed with a hollow, resonant sound that cut the night like a blade. Screws tightened, the iron groaned, and then the first spade of earth struck wood. A dull thud, then another, and another. The rhythm became steady like a muffled drumbeat, burying her heartbeat beneath it. Above ground, the elders held their lanterns steady, their faces half in shadow. None spoke, none intervened. Each thud of earth sealed not only Eleanor's body beneath the soil, but also the town's silence. Martha turned away, shoulders shaking, her sobs smothered into her apron. She would hushed quickly, forced back into the line of spectators, another voice silenced beneath the weight of ritual. The mound rose, the lanterns dimmed, the last layer of soil was pressed flat against the ground. The gathering began to disperse, their silence intact, their complicity unbroken. And beneath it all, in the suffocating dark satin pressed against her skin, Eleanor clutched the bell and rang it. Its bright chime echoed sharply inside the coffin, filling her ears, but above the earth, nothing. The sound was swallowed, muffled, absorbed into silence. For the first time, she understood. This was not a test of love. This was a tradition of erasure, and the bell in her hand was not a lifeline. It was a weapon turned against her. Darkness closed around her the moment the lid sealed, a suffocating dark so complete it seemed alive. At first Eleanor held her breath, straining for a sound. Footsteps above, the scrape of a shovel, anything to prove she had not been abandoned. But there was only the drumbeat of earth settling overhead, the hollow echo of her own pulse thundering in her ears. She clutched the silver bell until her knuckles ached, shaking it once. Its chime rang bright and sharp in the confined box, almost deafening in the silence. She waited. Nothing. She shook it again, harder, the cord scraping against satin. Still nothing. No answering call, no rush of hands to free her, no proof of devotion. Only silence. Her breathing grew shallow, the air thin, each inhale dragging with the taste of soil and rot. A thin reed of a tube had been left at the coffin's head, a fragile promise of air. But it was not life. It was delay. It carried only enough breath to prolong her fear. With each inhale she tasted the earth itself, damp and metallic, as though the ground was already claiming her. Panic swelled. She pounded her fists against the satin walls until her arms throbbed. She screamed, her voice ricocheting back at her, strangled by the wood. No one could hear her, not because she wasn't loud enough, but because no one was listening. At last, trembling and exhausted, she stilled. Her fingertips brushed the coffin walls, searching for distraction, for proof she was not already dissolving into the void. That was when she felt it. An irregularity beneath the satin. A shallow groove. She pulled at the lining until the fabric tore beneath her nails, exposing the wood. There, etched into the coffin, were letters. Initials. S.B. 1867. Her breath caught. She moved her fingers further, tracing more ridges. E.W. 1874. Names. Dates. The satin had hidden them, but the coffin itself had been scarred by those who came before. Her nails scraped deeper, frantic, searching every surface she could reach. There were more, a cluster of initials near her shoulder, another set at her feet, then a longer name, carved shakily, letters uneven as though cut in the final moments of breath. Eliza. Eleanor's heart pounded. This was no ceremonial coffin, no sacred relic. It was a chamber of suffocation, used and reused. Every bride before her had been given the same bell, the same promise, the same silence. They had clawed their names into the wood as the only rebellion left to them, desperate proof that they had lived, even if their town chose to erase them. The realization settled like ice in her chest. She was not alone in this coffin. She was crowded by ghosts, their names pressed into the walls, their final moments embedded in the splinters beneath her fingertips. The bell slipped in her sweaty hand. She rang it again, weaker this time, not out of hope, but out of despair. It was not a lifeline. It was an instrument of cruelty, a sound meant only to echo back into her own ears while the world above carried on in silence. She pressed her palm against the carved names, her hand fitting into the grooves, and felt their presence pressing back. The women before her had not been saved. They had been buried, forgotten, absorbed into the soil of Blackwood tradition. And now she understood the truth with absolute clarity. She had never been the bride of Alistair Blackwood. She had been his offering. Above the earth, the world carried on as though Eleanor Whitfield had simply vanished into grief's theatre. Black crepe was draped across the manor veranda. The upper windows were shuttered. Servants moved with rehearsed solemnity, their faces carefully schooled into masks of mourning. And Alistair Blackwood, her husband, her jailer, her executioner, moved through it all like a man perfected by sorrow. He received visitors with bowed head and folded hands, his voice hushed, his gaze lowered. He spoke of Eleanor as though she had been taken too soon, his grief measured, his composure precise. Neighbors leaned in with soft condolences, pressing casseroles into the hands of servants, setting jars of preserves upon the polished tables. Not one of them asked a question. Not one of them dared. The men who had stood in the graveyard lantern light days before now sat in his parlor, murmuring over brandy. Their words carried weight, but not of sympathy. For them, grief was a transaction. "We stand with you, Alistair," they said. "The Blackwoods endure." Each phrase was a seal pressed over silence, another layer of earth upon Eleanor's living tomb. The women whispered, of course, behind lace handkerchiefs, in parlors thick with perfume and secrets. But their whispers never grew into resistance. They wondered aloud if Eleanor had been too fragile, too unprepared for the weight of her station. Their words placed the blame on her shoulders, never his. They dressed her suffocation as weakness, her burial as fragility. Meanwhile, Martha moved like a shadow through the halls, her eyes swollen from weeping, her lips pressed shut with knowledge that could never be spoken. She had heard the bell once, faint, almost imagined, drifting up from beneath the soil. She knew what it meant. But when she tried to speak of it to Thomas, he gripped her arm until she fell silent. His jaw was clenched, his eyes clouded with the terrible burden of a man who has chosen survival over truth. For 3 days, the charade of mourning continued. Alistair played his role flawlessly, walking through the town with black armband tight against his sleeve, his eyes hollow with calculated grief. And the town rewarded him, not with suspicion, but with loyalty, for what was the truth compared to the power of the Blackwood name? What was one bride's life weighed against the patronage of a family that owned their debts, their lands, their futures? But beneath the earth, Eleanor still breathed, faint, shallow, but alive. She still rang the bell, weaker now, her wrist aching, her voice gone raw from screams no one would hear. The names carved into the coffin pressed around her like companions in the dark, their grooves cutting into her fingertips until her skin bled. She began to realize something profound and terrifying. The silence above her was not ignorance. It was consent. The bell was never meant to summon rescue. It was meant to test the town itself. Would they answer, or would they allow another bride to vanish into soil and silence? And every time they had chosen silence, every time they had allowed the ritual to continue. Eleanor's lungs burned, her body weakening. But even in her terror, she made a decision. If she was to vanish, she would not vanish nameless. She dug her nails deeper into the wood, carving letters beside the others, tearing her skin open to leave proof. She traced her name into the grain. Eleanor, 1891. The wood splintered beneath her nails, but she did not stop. She pressed her blood into the grooves, staining her name into the coffin, refusing to be erased. And somewhere above in the Blackwood parlor, Alistair smiled politely at another condolence, raising a glass in silent acknowledgement. To them, Eleanor was already gone. To him, so, he was proof of devotion. But to herself, to the names carved in the dark around her, she was still alive. For now. Time lost its meaning in the coffin. Minutes bled into hours, hours into something far more monstrous. Eleanor's breaths came shallow and strained, her chest rising against the weight of soil pressing down. She clung to consciousness the way a drowning soul clings to driftwood, grasping, slipping, clawing back. Every ring of the silver bell grew weaker, each chime mocking her with the clarity of sound that reached no one, saving nothing. But in that abyss, survival sharpened into clarity. She began to understand that this was no test of love. This was no private rite. It was a ritual of power. The coffin was not meant to bind husband and wife. It was meant to bind a community in silence. The elders, the reverend, the servants, the women who whispered, each of them was part of the machinery. Their complicity was not cowardice alone. It was necessity. The Blackwoods ruled by debt, by land, by history. To refuse Alistair was to risk ruin, to risk being cast out into poverty, disgrace, or worse. And so they obeyed. They turned their faces away. They allowed the burial of brides again and again because resistance meant annihilation. And here lay the deeper corruption. This ritual was not about devotion, but about control. A husband demanded absolute obedience, and a town proved its loyalty by enforcing it. The coffin was not Eleanor's prison alone. It was the valley's cage, an invisible leash on every soul that lived beneath the Blackwood shadow. To ring the bell was to demand truth, to force ears to hear what they pretended not to. That was why no one came, because to answer the bell was to shatter the pact of silence that had kept them alive for generations. Eleanor's mind swam. as these revelations crashed upon her. Her hand moved across the coffin walls, tracing the carved names again, Eliza, S.B., E.W. Each of them had faced this same knowledge. Each had clawed their protest into the wood when their voices failed. They had not been weak. They had not been fragile. They had been erased by design. Her heart thundered with a new rhythm. Not panic, but defiance. If the coffin was meant to silence her, then she would make it scream. Her fingers dug at the wood, splitting nails, drawing blood, inscribing her story beside theirs. Her body trembled, but her spirit sharpened. She whispered into the darkness, "I will not vanish. I will not be erased." The bell clinked faintly in her trembling hand. She shook it, not for rescue, but as a signal to herself, a reminder that she still lived, that her voice still existed, even if the world above conspired to bury it. And with each faint chime, she realized something darker still. Alistair did not intend to save her. He never had. His words of endurance and eternal love were lies stitched into a ritual older than either of them. He had inherited the coffin as other men inherit titles and lands. He was not simply testing Eleanor, he was reenacting the same script performed by his father, his grandfather, his great-grandfather. The Blackwood wives had always been buried. Those who survived, if any did, emerged broken, remade in obedience. Those who perished became the dirt that nourished the family's roots. The coffin was not simply a tomb, it was a forge. It crushed spirit until only silence remained. And Eleanor now understood. Whether she lived or died, Alistair would claim victory. Unless she could endure not as a test of devotion but as an act of rebellion, unless she could emerge not broken but sharpened by what she had seen, unless she could carry the names carved into this coffin with her, turning their erased voices into a weapon. Her breaths grew weaker, her heart slowed, but her mind blazed, and above her, the town continued its charade of mourning, while Alistair raised his glass to the silence that had always protected him. But somewhere in that silence, faint and relentless, a bell kept ringing, a sound that no longer begged for salvation, but promised revenge. In the coffin, Eleanor's body weakened, but her mind refused to collapse into surrender. The darkness pressed against her eyes, the soil crushed her chest, and yet, beneath the suffocating weight, something within her shifted. Terror began to twist into defiance. What Alistair intended as a ritual of obedience was becoming inside her a crucible of transformation. She traced the carved names again and again, whispering them as though reciting scripture. Eliza, S.B., E.W. Each letter was a spark, each groove a testament. These women had not been erased. They had left warnings, fragments of rebellion. Eleanor pressed her bloodied fingertips into their letters until her skin burned. "I am not alone," she whispered, voice hoarse, "and I will not die silent." Her thoughts sharpened, piercing through the fog of fear. She saw the truth in full clarity. The coffin was not meant only for her. It was the foundation of Blackwood power. Every wife buried alive, every townsperson complicit, every silence swallowed. It all reinforced the family's dominion. The coffin was a symbol of absolute control, a system that demanded obedience from one woman to break the spirit of all. She gripped the bell again, not as a plea for rescue but as a weapon of defiance. Each ring was no longer a call to Alistair, it was a declaration to herself, to the forgotten women whose names surrounded her. With every trembling chime she was saying, "You will not erase me, you will not own me, I will outlast you." The air thinned further, her breaths rasping like dry leaves. Her body screamed for surrender, but her mind grew darker, sharper. She began to imagine Alistair above, smiling at condolences, drinking brandy with the elders who enabled him. She imagined their smug satisfaction that the ritual had consumed yet another bride, and with each imagined face, her resolve hardened. The coffin, she realized, was the perfect metaphor for the world above. A box where voices are trapped, where power presses down like soil, where names are forgotten unless clawed into wood with blood. Every institution, every sermon, every debt collected by the Blackwoods, all of it was another layer of earth meant to suffocate truth. And yet, She had found the cracks. The names were the cracks. The grooves in the coffin walls proved that silence was never total. Resistance had always existed, even if buried. Her chest ached, her vision blurred. She knew the edges of unconsciousness were near, but before the darkness could take her fully, she made a choice. With the last of her strength, she carved deeper, gouging her full name, Eleanor Whitfield, 1891. The letters jagged, smeared with blood, but alive. She left herself not as victim, but as witness. She rang the bell once more, not for rescue, but for remembrance. And in that moment, something happened. Not outside the coffin, no shovel broke the earth, no hand reached to save her. But inside herself, the coffin ceased to be her prison. It became her testament. She realized with a chilling clarity that survival was not simply drawing breath. Survival was leaving proof. Survival was carrying the voices of the erased into eternity. The soil pressed harder, her lungs burned hotter, but she whispered into the dark, words only the buried could hear. "You did not kill me. You forged me." And for the first time, the bell in her hand did not sound like mockery. It sounded like prophecy. Halfway through this story, I must turn to you, the one listening. If you understand what Eleanor began to see in the dark, that systems of control bury voices, that silence is complicity, that survival is defiance, then write this in the comments right now. The bell will not be silenced. The bell will not be silenced. Type it twice, so it etches into your mind the way her name carved into that coffin etched into the wood, because to hear this story and remain unchanged is to side with the Blackwoods. To repeat it is to break the soil. Eleanor's body might have been trapped in satin and mahogany, but her spirit had broken through. She had become more than a bride, more than a victim. She had become dangerous knowledge, and dangerous knowledge cannot stay buried forever. Above the ground, the world accepted its script. The shutters stayed drawn, the crepe stayed hung, and Alistair Blackwood played the role of bereaved husband so flawlessly that the town rewarded him with silence. His sorrow was their shield. Their complicity was his crown. No one spoke of the coffin, no one acknowledged the bell. To do so would be to rip open the ground and expose the rot beneath their feet. Beneath that soil, Eleanor hovered at the edge of life, every breath a war against suffocation. Her body weakened, but her will had been reforged in fire and darkness. Each carved name beneath her fingertips was no longer a reminder of defeat, but a chorus urging her to hold on. Eliza, S.B.E.W. They were not gone. They were alive in the grooves of the wood, alive in the rebellion etched into splinters, alive in Eleanor's decision to carve her own name beside theirs. Did she survive? History does not record it. The Blackwood archives never speak her name again. The town's ledgers note only her death, tidy and proper, as though she had slipped quietly into the grave like any bride claimed by fever or misfortune. The silence swallowed her, as it had swallowed all the others, but the coffin tells another story. When years later the ground at the Blackwood plot shifted and the old caskets were disturbed, workers whispered of scratches gouged deep into the mahogany, of names upon names etched in blood and desperation. Among them, fresh, defiant, was hers. Eleanor Whitfield, 1891. Proof that she had not gone quietly. Proof that even buried alive, she had declared her existence. That is the legacy no ledger could erase, not obedience, not devotion, defiance. And here is the truth you were never meant to hear. The Blackwood ritual was never about love. It was about control. The coffin was not a test of devotion between husband and wife. It was a system designed to teach the community obedience, to teach silence, to remind everyone in that valley what happened when you challenged power. The women buried were not simply victims, they were instruments. Their suffering was the currency that bought the Blackwood dynasty its dominion. Eleanor's story is not a ghost tale, it is a mirror. Look at it closely and you will see the same patterns in every age. Families, churches, institutions, governments, all with their coffins, their bells, their rituals dressed in the language of tradition and love. And each time, the people around them, neighbors, servants, elders, choose silence because silence feels safer than truth. But Eleanor proved something in that coffin that cannot be buried. Even in the suffocating dark, even when the air is gone and the bell rings unheard, defiance survives. The scratches in the wood outlast the silence above. And now you, listening, must choose. Do you stay silent like the townsfolk who bowed their heads and offered casseroles to a murderer? Or do you carve your name into the walls of history, refusing to vanish, refusing to let the bell die in your hand? This is dangerous knowledge. Once you hear it, you cannot return to ignorant. Say. The Blackwoods were not unique. They were only one mask of an ancient system that has buried voices for centuries. But if you understand this, if you feel the coffin walls pressing against you, if you hear the bell ringing inside your own chest, you know what you must do, because the true terror is not that Eleanor may have died in the coffin. The true terror is that the world above chose to let her, and now so do you,